Welcome back to Building Blocks on IoT. That's Jeremy Foster and I'm Christopher Harrison. Now, I like the little wave there. We just took a look at the operating system and where Windows 10 falls into the grand scheme of things with IoT, and saw that, it is that write once run on many types of devices. But of course, that then begs the question, if we're going to write, we need to, write code. We need to know what the development experience is going to look like. So what does that development experience look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll contrast this a little bit with, I've been doing a lot of IoT development with Linux, which, as I mentioned before, I think is a good operating system for certain scenarios. And the whole development/deployment cycle takes some real thought, because it's hard to get the code deployed out to the device, running, and then activated as active apps, so that when the device is restarted, they come up. So there takes quite a bit of thought, and I love that with Windows 10, it's a much easier, more sane experience trying to not only write my code, but deploy my code on my device, and then get my code to run when I want it to, and then even to go a step further and allow me to debug my code remotely to this device. So that's just a wonderful scenario. So I'm excited to talk about this. So we're going to talk about the development story and the deployment story. And the thing here is that you're developing against a subset of an operating system that shares the exact same core as Windows 10, the same one that's running on your desktop. But this is the core, and it doesn't have all of the namespaces available that Windows on the phone or Windows on the desktop may have. Okay, so what we've got here is a list of namespaces that are not yet available on Windows 10 IoT Core. And in the documentation, it calls it out as a list that's not yet available, insinuating that they're working on these namespaces. Now, this is a big list that, of course, you can't really make any meaning out of in a short time. So I've summarized these for you. There are 142 of them, and at first glance, it looks like a pretty big list, but really this is a list of the actual classes that are not available. And so they tend to be pretty small. So for instance, let me blow out here this Windows.UI namespace. And there are certain things like, look at the bottom here, the Windows UI.xaml. Out of all of the XAML namespace, I don't have the list picker flyout and these two background converters. So that's not bad.
I think I'd be okay with that.
Do you use those every day, or?
Well, no.
Me neither.
Okay.
But I tend to use HTML more than XAML these days anyway. But yeah, so anyway, you have this limited set of namespaces, but it's not very limited at all, which is really good news for us as developers. And then besides the things that you don't have, there are some other things that you do have because they only make sense on the device. Now, this isn't done by essentially modifying the core or anything. Once again, same exact core. This is done by making available to you as the developer something called an extension, so that when you're developing your app, you target Windows 10 IoT, or you target Windows 10 Core, and then you bring in an extension for whatever device type or platform family that you want to target. So if you're targeting phones, you can bring in the phone extension. If you're targeting IoT, you can bring in the IoT extension. Because when you're dealing with an IoT project, you're dealing with this device, you have some things that you don't have on your phone. Like, take a look at your phone and tell me if you have a bank of pins like this that you're expecting to be able to address.
Let me check my phone.
Yeah. Does it?
No.
No, mine neither. I do have a couple of pins, but they're in the shape of USB. So, yeah, when you're dealing with an IoT device, you've got these pins, and these things feel like magic because every one of these can be connected to a different sensor or a different input or output, And so this is what lights up the ability to read the temperature and write to an LCD screen or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So these are exciting, but they just don't apply to the phone and the desktop. And so you install this IoT extension, and now all of a sudden you have windows.devices.gpio, general purpose input output. You have access to that namespace, whereas you don't in the others. And again, that's done by way of an extension. So you can see here in this picture of a typical IoT project that I've right-clicked on references and said I want to add a reference, and I add the Windows IoT extension for UWP. It's the easiest thing in the world. It's exactly like what you do 7 times a day, in your normal development job when you're developing in .NET. In Visual Studio, you're bringing in references, and here you're just bringing in an extension as a reference. Okay, so now this device that has these pins on it and that I'm writing code for, I need to get my code over to it. And you might expect that, now maybe I have a manual process where I've got to find a way to file share these over or FTP them over or something like that. But in fact, that's not the case. In Visual Studio, the first time you say, let me remote debug, and you just hit the magic green button in Visual Studio, go, it says, I'm going to need an IP address for this machine. And in fact, anytime subsequent to that, you can go right-click on the project and go to the properties, and you have this box that allows you to specify the remote machine, either its name or its IP address. And once you've done that, it now knows what its target is, and pressing F5 or pressing the magic green button in Visual Studio does a series of really nice steps. It builds your code, it deploys your code to the device as a UWP package, and then it actually executes the code. And if you've pressed F5 or just pressed the button without saying run without debugging, then it's actually in debug mode as well. So it's actually attached. So I can be watching my light blink over here on my IoT device, and I can be braking at breakpoints on my IDE. So that's really a wonderful scenario.
So kind of everything that I would typically expect with Visual Studio, because if I'm going to be working with, let's say, with a website, or if I'm going to be working with like an Office add-in for O365, that I go in, I'm creating whatever it is, I hit F5, and it will actually go in with the case of like an Office add-in and update and add it to my copy of Outlook or my copy of Word, so then that way I can go in, I can see what's going on, and I can do debugging. I'm going to get that exact same experience even on that remote device with the IoT.
That's right. Yeah, in the IoT development that I've been doing on Linux, each of these is a separate step, where first I have to do some kind of build. Actually, I'm usually writing JavaScript, so it's not technically a build, but I have to do some sort of a build step, and then some sort of a deployment step, and then some sort of a configuration to set this as a default app, and then some sort of an execution where I tell it, okay, now go, like I want you to happen.
Right.
And then once that's all done, then I need to go tell my IDE. Visual Studio is smart enough to attach to a Linux box and do remote debugging. That's a really cool story. I'm glad that it's able to do that. But I do have to do that after the fact. I have to go attach to this running process on a remote Linux box.
And so it's just F5.
This is just F5. It's doing all those individual steps for you. And one of the nicest things about it is that it's a consistent experience with every other kind of programming that you do. Just like you mentioned Office.
Right.
Same with phone. You say, here's my phone, I write my app, and then I say go, and it's running on my phone. And that's what I've come to expect.
Exactly. Exactly. So again, it's that I'm going to write once, I'm going to use the exact same tooling, the exact same techniques, everything else, the skill set that I've already learned, now I'm just going to bring that into IoT.
Absolutely.
I love that.
Yep. Cloud, phone, desktop, databases, IoT, Office 365 apps, all of these things are just different targets. And in fact, in Visual Studio, since Visual Studio is a relatively rich IDE, I'm kind of mentally comparing it now to Visual Studio Code, which is kind of a lighter, scrappier instance of it. But Visual Studio has this concept of a solution with projects. And so if I'm an enterprise developer and I've got sometimes enterprise developers have many, many projects in one solution, and it makes perfect sense. These are all different components of what we do here. We have a database project and an IoT project. We've got 3 web projects and a mobile project. All these different projects live in the same solution. And IoT is just another one of those. It's not a different use case.
I love that.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So now I should mention here as well that you can, I mentioned that you can use C# and kind of the classic Windows means for creating these apps and targeting IoT. But at this point, I might also choose to write my app using Node. And I can do that as well. If you go to windowsondevices.com, and you'll see that in my list of resources here coming up, because it's a great URL that kind of gives you all of this information about Windows IoT Core. If you go to windowsondevices.com, you'll see a project that you can download that will allow you to make a UWP and write the whole thing in JavaScript. In fact, you just write in the style of Node.js, importing or requiring a package that gives you access to the entire underlying UWP, the underlying operating system, so that now all of a sudden you can access the core namespaces and classes and stuff like that. So
perfect.
That's just kind of another way to do it.
Okay.
All right, so that's what I've got for development and deployment. I realize that it's pretty brief, but I really don't think you guys are going to have any trouble, especially as Visual Studio .NET developers. You guys know this space. It's really just a matter of bringing in this extra extension, configuring your IP, those 2 steps that I showed you, and then hitting the green button that you've come to love, and then your code is running on the device. So let's look at a little summary of what we looked at here. There are some namespaces that aren't there. There are some new namespaces, such as the GPIO. There is an extension that you bring in for universal apps, and it's really about that simple. Then it lights up these scenarios like remote debugging, just the way that you expect, really. All right, so that's it for development and deployment.
Okay.
We're gonna look at another module here soon.
Yeah, I'm thinking that if we're going to call it Internet of Things, we should probably talk a little bit about the internet side
internet
of things.
part, yeah.
We took a look at the things part. How about the internet part?
We're doing it backward.
Yeah, I suppose.
Start with the things and then the internet.
Yeah. So let's do the internet, but let's take a break first.
All right.
All right, we'll do that.